Order the August 8th Planning Commission meeting. As always, we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Commissioner Christian.
Present.
Commissioner Magai is absent. Commissioner Inga is absent. And then Vice Chair Heschler
I'm here.
and Chair Keldorf.
Here.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you. Welcome, Commissioner Christian.
Happy to be here.
Good. Glad to have you. Okay, we will start with public communications. Anyone wishing to come on up, now is the time. Seeing none, we'll close public communications. Any written communications?
None received.
Moving on to the consent calendar, just one item, Planning Commission meeting minutes from June 27th. Can I take a motion to approve?
I motion. I second.
Commissioner Kirsten,
Yes.
Commissioner Inga is absent. Commissioner Magai is absent. And Vice Chair Heschler
Aye.
and Chair Keldorf.
Yes. Okay, moving on, no continued business, no new public hearings. New business, staff presentation on our parking amendment, presentation on study session on a potential amendment to the city's parking requirements for residential uses. Take it away, Paul.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Chair Keldorf and fellow commissioners. This item to you is part of our continuing efforts to implement the city's housing element, which, as you know, was adopted in November 2022 and only recently certified by the state this summer. As you know, the housing element has 11 different programs. The focus of tonight's presentation is program number 9, amendments to the municipal code, which are intended to incentivize housing construction and remove regulatory barriers to housing construction. It will be a relatively short presentation. Just wanted to let you know, just cover some basic items and then have a nice discussion about this. So program number 9 has or calls for amendments to 12 different topic areas. 11 of those amendments have been completed to date, the most recent one having been completed in May of this year. So the one remaining amendment to complete is on residential parking requirements. Program number 9 in the housing element says this specifically about this particular item. The current parking requirement for residential uses is 2 parking spaces per unit plus 1 guest parking space for every 3 units in a development, irrespective of unit size. And this program or action item calls for revising the requirements to a sliding scale based on unit size, something similar to what the city approved with the Pacific Coast Commons specific plan project. This is the parking requirement in the Pacific Coast Commons specific plan. As you can see, there's this sliding scale that's based on not exactly unit size or area, but number of bedrooms. So 1 space required for studio units, 1.5 spaces for 1-bedroom units, and 2 spaces for 2-bedroom units, and 1/3 of a space per unit for guest parking. This is the mix of units in the approved Pacific Coast Commons development project. As you can see, out of 257 apartments, over 200 were studio or 1-bedroom units. And if the regular code requirement applied to this development, a lot more parking would have been required. But we'll look at some of those numbers because in a little bit, because we'll use the Pacific Coast Commons project as a sort of a case study to compare parking rates. But before we get into those parking rates, just wanted to cover some of the reasons or the purpose for amending the code to a sort of a sliding scale. And the reasons on the slide are basically that it more accurately reflects parking needs. So it's very intuitive. If you have more bedrooms in a house, you're likely to have more drivers and need more parking. So if you have only one bedroom or just a studio, you're likely to need less parking. Along with that, if there's sort of a little bit less parking required for those smaller units, that means that there's less parking to construct as part of an overall development. So that facilitates residential construction, that sort of reduction in the amount of parking. It reduces the cost and it also saves space on a property. And that also has its own sort of benefits as far as traffic and potential environmental benefits. Another reason is that there is this tendency in state law to move in that direction, to reduce parking requirements, to use sliding scales. That's reflected in our own housing element because it has this action item in there too. And this is part of the reason it was certified by the state, that we committed to changing our requirements to more of a sliding scale. So with that, I just want to go straight into some research that we did. The program does not say specifically you must adopt the Pacific Coast Commons parking rate. It just says change to a sliding scale, something similar to the Pacific Coast Commons project. So we did a little bit of research on, what is required in the city today, in different parts of the city, because we have some specific plans and overlays. We looked at some other cities as well, and then also looked at what is recommended by the Institute of Transportation Engineers and their manual. So with that, I will just go through each of these items briefly. Our current code, as I mentioned earlier, requires 2 parking spaces, sort of a flat rate for every unit. The Pacific Coast Commons project, as I mentioned earlier, has that sliding scale where it says 1 space for studios, 1.5 spaces for 1 bedroom, and then 2 spaces for 2-bedroom units. In the downtown, the new downtown specific plan, and in the new RENA overlay districts that the city adopted, there is a per bedroom requirement also. And in those 2 situations or cases, it's a 1-to-1. So if you have 1 bedroom, it's 1 parking space. If you have 2 bedrooms, it's 2 parking spaces. We did a survey of 10 other cities. Most of those cities had a flat rate of 2 parking space per unit. The exceptions were Long Beach and Culver City. Long Beach had a sliding scale where they required even less parking than what we have in our downtown or RENA overlays. Culver City actually has no parking minimums today. A long time ago when I worked there, they required 2 parking spaces for every unit. They did not require fully enclosed garages, but they required at least covered parking. But today, they require no parking. They leave it up to the property owner or developer to decide. We also consulted with the ITE manual. The Institute of Transportation Engineers conducts parking demand studies. They go to different developments and they do studies of parking demand, on various uses. And on average, in the cases where they've studied multifamily residential, they've come up with 2 different rates. One is a per bedroom rate, requiring 1 space per bedroom, or if you converted that to a per unit rate, it would be a 1.7 space per unit ratio. This is what we found in our research, but to kind of make that a little bit more better understood, we went ahead and used the Pacific Coast Commons project as a case study, and we calculated what the parking requirements would be based on these rates here. So the next slide shows that. So the Pacific Coast Commons project, as I mentioned earlier, 257 apartment units. Under the current code, it would require a total of 599 spaces, including residents and guests. The specific plan, based on its rates, required 450, so that's roughly a 25% reduction from our current code for that development. And it kind of reflects the mix of units, right? They have a lot of smaller units in the mix. In the downtown or in our arena overlays, if that same project was proposed, the requirement would be 304 spaces total. There are no guest parking spaces required in those two places, our arena overlays or the downtown. And then in the other cities, which have that flat rate, the numbers kind of reflect what we have in our regular code. But their guest parking requirements, the range is really wide, going from 1/8 of a parking space per unit to 1 to 1. And then based on the IT manual, depending on which rate you use to calculate parking, you can see the results there. Just real briefly, some other considerations, possible considerations for parking. One of them being sort of the location. You know, the state makes a big deal out of proximity to transit, to train stations and so forth. In other cases, planners think about proximity of uses to services or to jobs, So you could, in theory, look at the city, and say, hey, here in the downtown, we have a lot of jobs. We have the civic center. We have schools. So there's a lot of sort of destinations for people. So it might make sense to have a reduced parking requirements in this area of town, or in another part of town where there's more jobs or shopping and so forth. I just wanted to mention that there's other ways to look at parking and the rates. I just wanted to bring that up. Another topic might be the type of parking that's required. So in our city and in most cities, for single-family residential, we require a fully enclosed garage. For multifamily, we require a carport, meaning enclosed on 3 sides. For guest spaces or commercial uses, we allow them to be open, no enclosure necessarily required. Just another consideration on guest parking, we could look at that if you're interested in delving into that requirement. And just to reiterate, today's current requirement in the municipal code is 1 space per 3 units. In the Pacific Coast Commons specific plan, it's 1/3 of a parking space per unit. It's slightly different because of the way you round those calculations. So if you were to apply the Pacific Coast Commons rate, it would result in an extra parking space, and that's about it. So that's more or less our presentation. We just wanted to show you a few facts, and considerations, and just take your thoughts and direction, and then we can, provide information if you have questions for us, or if you want us to look into something, we can take some time and do some more research, or you have some direction for us, we can take that into account and then move forward with drafting an ordinance and proceeding with this.
Thank you, Paul. A question of clarity for me. Are we talking about changing the parking requirement just in the new overlay zones, or is this just for multifamily development, or are we talking about a standardized parking code for all residential development?
Thank you. We are looking at changing the requirement for multifamily residential in the municipal code, meaning all the multifamily areas outside of those specific plans and overlays. So more or less the R3 zone.
R3s,
Yeah.
okay. And then what happens if there's a 3-bedroom unit?
Well, we have to kind of decide what we
Or
want to do
more
with
than
that.
that.
Yes, so, since you asked about a 3-bedroom unit, and I should go to the, rates table that I showed you earlier, so let me do that. So in the Pacific Commons specific plan, 2 spaces was the max. So even if you had a 3-bedroom unit, 2 spaces would be the max requirement. And that's the same in the downtown specific plan. If you have a 3-bedroom unit, then you are only required to provide 2 spaces for the unit. However, in arena overlay districts, the rate is a per bedroom, pure per bedroom. So if you had a 3-bedroom unit, then you would be required to provide 3 parking spaces in our arena overlays. That's just how those standards are written there. So this is something that we can take into account, and if you have thoughts on that particular issue, we can take those into account, or we'll take your direction on that. Generally speaking, if you are inclined to, let's say you're concerned about having enough parking, you might be on the side of requiring an extra space for larger units, more than 2-bedroom. If you want to incentivize housing production more, then you might want to consider kind of putting a cap at the 2 spaces. But it's entirely up to your philosophy or how you approach the issue.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? I think anything else I have to say is more just conversational.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple questions. So again, just to clarify, the RENA overlay allows three spots for a 3-bedroom unit, the way it's currently written.
It would require for a 3-bedroom unit, 3 spots.
Okay, but what we're talking about in this new language is reducing it to 2, but it'll still stay 3 in the RENA overlay.
Right. At this point, we're not looking at changing the rules for those arena overlay sites, but the rest of the R3 zone,
Gotcha.
basically.
Do you have a sense of what percentage of units in El Segundo are 3 bedrooms or more?
3 bed or more. I don't have that percentage. The only thing I would say is about that is that generally speaking, households tend to be smaller in size. Over time, that household size tends to decrease. Today, based on the recent census data, I saw that average household size is 2.4 persons per unit, per household. So that can give you an idea of how many drivers do you need in each unit in town on average, and how many parking spaces that would sort of translate to.
Right. And of course, this is talking about new construction or renovations. It's not like people would be taking parking away from an existing non-conforming.
That's correct. This is not
Space.
about doing something retroactive, right?
Chair, if I may, Commissioner Heschler, can you repeat the question about the number of bedrooms? I just quickly looked in the housing element. I think I might be able to answer that. What was the?
I think I asked a couple questions, but one of them was, do we have an idea of the percentage of 3-bedroom units and higher that might be anticipated in new construction in town?
Okay, I don't have that.
Come on, Michael.
I have
so
number of units, multifamily.
Well,
I'll keep looking, but
okay.
I thought we had number of bedrooms per unit, some average data, but maybe not.
If you were thinking about what's anticipated, I think that average number of persons per unit kind of gives you a clue about where things are headed.
Right.
So we are likely, and if you take the Pacific Coast Commons project into account, I think the trend is to have more smaller units because there's demand for that. You have also based on census data, although don't have specific numbers. You have aging population, right? You have older couples or single seniors that need less space than they did previously. And they are growing as a proportion of the overall population. So that gives you a sense of the trend of what type of housing we will need in the future.
I have a friend with 2 kids in Santa Monica, and they're in their 20s, and neither of them have a driver's license. It's like, I'm seeing that more and more these days.
If there is an affordability component, then that alters the parking code, correct? And that's its own thing. We're not talking about that because that's standardized.
If someone is taking advantage of the state's density bonus law, yes, then there's absolute maximums that state law sets for those types of developments, yeah.
Well, and to that end, is the state requiring us to do any of the things that you're describing up here in these calculations, or is this up to the city?
The state, let's say, and the city is kind of requiring of itself to transition to a sliding scale. It is in our housing element. In other words, it is a city goal, but based on the input we received from the state. The state didn't necessarily say you need to have this specific parking rate throughout your city, but we committed, in a sense, to transitioning to a sliding scale. And that was sort of a consideration when the state decided to certify our housing element. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Sure, yeah.
I think an area that we haven't talked about a lot lately, but we spent a lot of time talking about before, was the R3 around like Washington Park. And if I'm really dusting things off and trying to remember when we started talking about parking, it was because we did this analysis that if you took everything down and started from scratch, you would actually get less units built than what's there currently, because our code had gotten more restrictive, right? So currently, if you were to build, 4 townhomes on a lot that was zoned R3 and each had 3 bedrooms, then you would need 12, 15 maybe parking spaces, and you just couldn't develop that. So, and this is maybe more of the conversation, but I understand why the sliding scale. I'm really surprised that of the 10 cities that we surveyed, they're at or even higher than what our current code is. I was anticipating the opposite, so that is interesting, and something that I think might get some community pushback.
Well, my question to that very topic is, these surveys that you did, if they surveyed us, they would simply have our current numbers.
Yes.
And are the cities
Right.
trending in the way that we are describing now? So a year from now, we'd kind of be talking about different numbers in other cities?
Well, that is likely because we just went through a housing element sort of update cycle, and a lot of cities are working on, their own code amendments and their own housing programs. So it is likely that we would see some of these cities have different parking requirements in the next few years.
And
Yeah.
let me expand a little bit on that too. So keep in mind the impetus for the parking changes or discussion that we're having is the premise that HCD challenged us based on state legislation that we need to remove barriers or eliminate or reduce barriers to housing production. The number one cost contributor to housing production or any development really is parking. So it's a very common strategy that the state accepts cities to use to say, hey, we're going to make development cheaper by requiring less parking. So that's the premise of why this is being explored now. There's a whole nother energy of discussion of parking in cities like Culver City or some of the other West Side cities. There's a whole different discussion of why they're reducing or eliminating parking requirements that's really driven by Donald Shoup, who's a premier parking guru or anti-parking guru from UCLA. And there's a whole different movement that those cities are exploring. Culver City's reduction of parking requirements has nothing to do with their housing element. It's entirely driven by a discussion that's very progressive about what they want to do with parking and how they want to facilitate growth in their city. there's probably, like Paul mentioned, a lot of other cities in our position where it was part of a discussion with HCD of how we were going to reduce the cost of production of housing. One of those ways was reducing the parking requirement. And if you recall, when we had John Kaliski here, that was part of the discussion in developing the objective design standards for an increased density, which was established by doing the opposite study of what you were referencing. We flipped it and we said, okay, what density will it take to flip these? And then we asked John, we came and got feedback from the commission, said, if we have to cram in 65 units to the acre or whatever it was, how high do we want that? How wide, what's the lot coverage are we comfortable with? What are the setbacks are we comfortable with? And how do we squeeze in the parking that we need to, or that we're comfortable with keeping? So I just want to provide a little additional context to it. There's no right formula that the state's looking for. What the state is looking for is that we're making an active effort to reduce the cost or reduce the burden of constructing housing, and one of those is parking. So that's kind of where it comes from. And thanks to Eduardo, in the housing element that was adopted from 2014 to 18, the stats was that approximately 43% of the city's housing stock is comprised of 3 or more bedroom units. So roughly just less than half, 43% is comprised of 3 or more bedroom units.
So, and according to Paul's future crystal ball, that might be reduced in looking ahead, or can we kind of use that as a guide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a reasonable point, and we've talked previously about the micro units and the trend
Sure.
towards building small units. So that's not a foreign topic to this commission, and that we've already had those conversations. And if you look at Pacific Coast Commons, the units trend smaller, and the bedroom counts trend smaller, and we talked about requiring a different mix, and so I think it's a fair point. And those of you who have participated in the conversations with housing projects that might be in the pipeline, you can see that some of those unit size mixes, they're looking at smaller sized units in some of those proposed developments that are circling out there today, but we haven't, brought those to you yet.
Yeah. And, I mean, it would be a maybe easier conversation if Pacific Coast Commons was live and we could see how that's working.
Yeah, you can have real-time data.
That's what I was thinking. Which sort of both of your comments kind of bring me to my questions. Since Pacific Coast Commons kind of predates my tenure, since my tenure started about half an hour ago.
But if it gets built and there's impacts, you'll certainly get blamed.
How did we come to the sliding scale that we're kind of using as the template for changing the code? Who drove that? Was it driven by the developer and we kind of negotiated to land here, or what drove this particular scale that we're
Yeah, good question. In fact, I meant to say a few words about that during my presentation. I'm glad you brought it up. So for the Pacific Coast Commons project, the developer at our sort of encouragement produced a parking demand study. So they hired a traffic engineering company. We reviewed their work. And they looked at similar type of developments, those mixed use developments in different parts of the state, and they counted parking. They went to different times of the day and at different sort of projects, actual projects, counted parking to see what was the actual need. And they tried to pick similar, developments just to get a fair sort of assessment. The parking demand study that they produced, and we had our separate consultant review their work and kind of found it to be, accurate or reliable. They actually concluded that even less parking was needed for the development that they were proposing. However, in our conversations with the developer, and also given the feedback that we got from the community and the concern about parking spillover, for instance, we came to that agreement to, instead of going at a 1-to-1, space per bedroom rate, to do that rate of 1 space per studio, 1.5 per 1 bedroom, and then 2 spaces for 2 bedroom. And the idea was, let's give ourselves a little cushion. Let's be a little more conservative just to make sure we don't have those impacts on the neighborhood and the street parking and so forth. So I hope that gives you a sense of how we ended up with that particular rate for that development.
Can you go back to the slide that showed the Pacific Commons mix? Okay.
I think, and also to expand a little bit, their study, and some of the analytics that we look at includes, so I don't know if we explain too much what the ITE manual is with the International Traffic Engineers, has produced 2 documents. One goes back probably nearly 100 years, which is trip generation rates. So depending on a use, office, commercial, retail, whatever, they've done studies year over year. They update the document every year with what, based on floor area, what that use generally trips, the number of vehicle trips that use generates. The other document that they produce, which they only update, I think, every 3 years, is a parking demand analysis or study. And they publish those results every few years. And I think it goes back to the 70s, if I remember correctly, where not they themselves, but consultants who do work with cities conduct an analysis, and you have to meet the strict criteria of the methodology that ITE sets for the analysis. But they study the uses in the same way for trip generation, but they do a parking demand analysis. So they actually go to existing facilities, hotel, retail, whatever it might be, and they actually analyze the parking demand for those uses, and then they aggregate the data, and they separate it out by different types of uses. So in this case, did you have a slide with the actual results from the IT manual? The rates, yeah. So what they found, and when you look at it, and I find it very interesting. I'm happy to forward some of it on because I think it's surprising. But what they found was that depending on the proximity of transit and the size of the housing, they found that it was essentially for anything within a half a mile of rail, 1.5 parking stalls per unit, or essentially 0.8 parking stalls per bedroom. And so they don't find the traditional 1-to-1 ratios or 2-to-1 ratios that most municipal codes have, because everybody just thinks 1 house, 2 cars, 2-car garage. That's been built like that since the 50s, basically. And so the studies actually show that there is not a 2-to-1 ratio as historically been implemented. And so that also informs the parking demand analysis, and that things like that have also informed why a sliding scale makes more sense, because the less bedrooms, the less likelihood that every single unit that has 1 bedroom isn't always going to have 2 occupants with 2 cars. There's scenarios where 2 occupants have 1 car, or it's only 1 occupant with 1 car, or it's 1 occupant who relies on public transportation, or some combination thereof. And so those analyses include information from the ITE manual, which is extremely reputable in the industry, as well as the comparative analytics that they provided for Pacific Coast Commons.
My other question is sort of a follow-on from something I think either one of the other commissioners mentioned, or maybe you did, was if we're in the midst of a big update from a lot of the surrounding other cities, and do we have a sense of where they are landing? And the next part of that is there some advantage to El Segundo being first movers or early movers in adopting this scale as opposed to another one?
I'll start, and Michael or Eduardo could jump in. We don't know exactly where each city is in the implementation of their housing elements, and I don't know for a fact that every city that we've surveyed has that action item in their housing element. As Michael said, that is one way to remove a barrier and incentivize housing development, Other cities may have chosen other ways to do that. So we'd have to go and kind of study each city's housing element and then follow up with their staff to find out where they are in the process. Now, as far as being the first in the area to adopt new parking rates, perhaps the advantage is that we will be first to incentivize more housing development in the city and be more competitive, let's say, in that respect, to make it cheaper to build more housing in the city.
But I guess if we already achieved this with Pacific Coast Commons as an example, right? We didn't have to change the municipal code to arrive at the sliding scale that they're using for their project. If there were other developers like showed up tomorrow and wanted to build a big project like that, would we go through a similar process that we did with them without changing the municipal code?
Yeah.
Well, in that particular case, they established new regulations for their particular property. So they changed the municipal code parking rate just for their property in order to build their project. If somebody came to the city and wanted to build a similar development on an R3 lot, the density, number one, would not permit a similar size development, and then the parking rate would be our current parking rate, the 2 spaces per unit. So that may be a factor kind of discouraging the development. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think I can, I missed a little bit, so I apologize if I'm reiterating what you already said, Paul, but I think part of it is that not every project will trigger what Pacific Coast Commons triggered. So we may not always have the opportunity to leverage an approval based on, a parking demand study. What the state's looking for is, for lack of better terms, a by right. What is allowed by right? If somebody, they don't want folks to have to get a specific plan, adopted for their development. And if you look at the rest of the R3 zones, which this would be applicable to, you're talking about the peripheral of the city, essentially, the peripheral of the residential component, portion of the city. So the question is, do the same standards that we consider for Pacific Coast Commons also apply to the most northwestern corner along Imperial? I don't know the answer to that, but I imagine we might have a little bit of a different discussion, or the southwestern corner in the Franklin, Whiting sort of neighborhood. Would we apply the same standards? I don't know, but I think what the state is looking for is that we do have sort of a new baseline that's scaled appropriately for what the actual demand is. Again, the state's only goal is reduce the cost of housing. The whole parking discussion is a different movement, but it just happens to coincide with what the state's goal is. So, part of it, or a big portion of it, is we won't always have the same opportunity with Pacific Coast Commons.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to think about, and probably other people already are, is how do we strike the balance, and wondering if is there a risk of boxing ourselves in too early if we don't have to? If, for example, the template for Pacific Coast Commons arrives at more parking than we might have otherwise have anticipated, but for them, we said, well, we're gonna ask for more parking for this project, slightly more parking for this project because of different factors. But now we're gonna use that as the template for the city. Are we not properly incentivizing residential development because we're gonna ask others to give that additional parking when we may not have necessarily wanted to? And again, that's why I go, okay, is there an advantage to us being the early adopters? Because part of this is going to be about competitive balance between, the other available development properties in our general area, right? And so are we locking ourselves in with asking for more parking when maybe the real answer would have been slightly less, and everybody around us amends their parking so that it's slightly less, and now we're not competitive with our neighbors? That's kind of where my brain went. was,
In other words, are we potentially giving up too much
yes.
parking?
Yes, in our
Yeah.
basic, right in the municipal code, just
Or
making it
requiring
less.
too much parking?
Yeah, requiring too much when we might have asked for less, or we might have gotten less, but we moved early, and everybody around us was like, ha, we got you, and,
We're gonna be.
and
more-
then we're gonna be
yeah.
back here again, trying to do variances to the new municipal code that we just updated.
So I'll share, I was not in Culver City when they abandoned all parking regulations. But I'll tell you that a lot of the motivation that was behind that, because the conversation started while I was still there, was really just letting the market dictate what's going to be parked. You cannot secure financing. You cannot reasonably pencil a project unless you know that you can secure tenants or residents or whatever it might be. And parking is a marketable tool that they use. Medical offices are infamous for over parking around the entire country. Wherever there's a medical office, they always park way more than what the city requires because their parking demand is actually much higher than what the city codes typically are, which were set usually in like the 60s. And so medical office is one of those things that even if we required no parking, they'd have an ocean of parking out there. Residential parking, there's a residential project in the pipeline that's very public, and they are proposing not to park it per our code because they are confident based on their own experience that they're parking it based on what they know on the properties that they've developed, owned, managed already for the last umpteen years. They're going to provide the parking that they know that they can lease their units at. And so I don't know if there'll ever be a scenario where nobody provides parking unless you force it. I think the only exception might be in a TOD, like up next to a metro station, a very progressive developer and a very progressive city allows and facilitates a development next to a metro station that has no parking because of the reliance on the metro station. But I think I understand your point. I mean, I don't think any city is going to actively volunteer to mend their parking code. It's a sensitive topic that's not always fun to talk about. So unless you're already in a city that's very, very progressive, like Culver City or Santa Monica or even Long Beach, where they have a much different political progressive appetite to talk about and sort of abolish parking, unless you're already in that environment, the rest of the cities are sort of, if we have to, we're going to. Otherwise, it's not, it's a very it can be a very divisive topic. So nobody's volunteering. And I don't know, like Paul said, we'd literally have to go look at all the codes for every city and make some calls and find out, hey, are you guys looking at this? Or are you going to have to? Is it in your housing element? Or is there some policy direction to do it? We have to do something.
Well, here's what we know. Reducing parking benefits a developer, right? I mean, that's the whole point of doing this. Reducing parking frustrates residents. And so even if Culver City is a progressive city, surely there's a bunch of people that have lived there for a long time. And what did Donald Shoup say to those people when his recommendation is you don't need that much parking? And the lady who's lived there 100 years says, I don't have a place to put my car on the street.
Oh, Donald Shoup is very comfortable just agreeing to disagree. I mean, he's very persuasive, but I mean, I was there when some of those conversations, and there's just some folks that won't agree.
Right.
It's because it's partially, if not significantly, a philosophical conversation, because he only knows what he's studied and what he believes are the outcomes of his analysis, his study. There's not a whole lot of real world application. There's a lot of small bits and pieces of examples of real world applications of what Donald's philosophy is, but Donald Shoup, just so we don't get Donald's confused tonight.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, but he's crafted this philosophy by taking these bits and pieces of of real-world application to inform what he believes is that, not that parking's not needed, but that, you know, the market will drive it, and if we can control the market, we can also control travel behavior. We can force heavier reliance on public transportation. I mean, it goes beyond, and I mean, honestly, I think it would just get to a point where he would just agree to disagree, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
In the Pacific Coast Commons scenario, they've got a bunch of visitor spots, guest spots. Are residents at Pacific Coast Commons not allowed to park in the guest spots? Or, you know, does overspill with Pacific Coast Commons actually just take up those guest spots? Do you know?
We did not regulate that detail. That would be sort of a management issue. Who
Right.
parks in their guest spots, who gets a permit to do that. In theory, those are guest spots, right? So you have your residents, and then I believe their parking will be segregated, separate from the guest parking.
Okay.
And then you would have guests or commercial tenant patrons using the guest parking, because their parking demand study in that particular case indicated that they had enough guest parking so that commercial tenants could share that parking with the residential guests. But we didn't go down to that detail. Yeah.
How I see this is that we're really not, even though we're using Pacific Coast Commons as the standard, we're really talking about R3, which is 30 units to the acre, not 87. And for 30 units to the acre, you're going to be building really townhomes, mostly 2s, potentially 3 bedrooms. I do think it pains me, having been on the development side, to imagine building a 3-bedroom townhome and requiring 3 parking spaces, which is what our code currently requires, correct? 1 per bedroom.
Our current code says 2 parking spaces per unit
Per
in the
unit.
R3. Yeah,
And then 1, and then a third. Okay. So really,
plus
in
guest
that
spaces.
regard, there's no change for a
Right.
2-bedroom unit. So it's just, if it's a 2 or 3-bedroom unit, it's the same. So a 1-bedroom unit would go
In our
from 2
current code.
stalls to 1.5.
Right, exactly.
Which does
A
not
1-bedroom
feel
unit.
earth-shattering to
No,
me.
not at all.
Part of this discussion is us getting sort of the barometer and, you know, what are the parameters of your concern so that we can craft something to fit within those parameters. And so if there's at least appetite to explore something like Pacific Coast Commons, that's good to know. If there's appetite to explore that with some other parameters, maximums, minimums, different ratios, you know, that's helpful information to know. If the number of units matters, you know, that type of stuff.
So I personally like the sliding scale. I guess my cautionary tale would be in positioning it up the food chain to council and to the community, using Pacific Coast Commons as the standard for something that really is significantly less dense,
Mhm.
because I think panic might ensue if that's how we position it, because everybody thinks of PCC as just this giant, which it is relative to really the sites that we're talking about.
So perhaps, forgive me for interrupting.
Yeah.
We could look at some smaller developments that the city has approved, like that 10-unit condo on Franklin and Whiting, was it? I can't remember which corner. Yeah, and some other condo projects that are a little bit more similar to what we might see in the R3, and see what that difference would be if we apply the different rates.
I think it's a great idea.
Right, okay.
Yeah, yeah. I
So
mean,
we can do
I don't know
that
that the
rate-
DR Horton project would have been relevant here, but maybe, and you know, that was probably two vehicles per unit, right?
Yes, I believe so. I don't think we changed the parking
Yeah.
rate for that
Yeah,
development.
when I first moved, when Reba and I first moved to El Segundo, we lived in a townhouse that had 7 units, brand new construction, and there was 2 parking spots per and a couple guests, and it was fine.
Yeah.
You know, we were on Imperial where everybody was parking on the street, and it did not feel underparked at all.
Got it.
Yeah, I'd be curious, how many guest spots are typically, I mean, just anecdotally, actually utilized? And to your point, maybe if that just becomes, or did you ask about overflow parking for
The
guests?
residents.
But I think we're on the right track.
Yep.
PCC was using originally, right, City of LA standards, and then and went a little bit above what City of LA requires.
We didn't have discussions about City of LA requirements. Maybe that's what they had in mind, but it didn't come up in conversation. Yeah.
Completely sidetracking this a little bit, is there any appetite to allow for other modes of transportation and commitments to facilitate other modes of transportation to subsidize required parking?
I feel like that's a question targeted to my friend here.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to fall on the bicycle sword by any stretch, but, you know, being close to transit is a thing. I don't think any of these residential projects, R3, are going to be close enough to a metro stop. I guess a bus stop falls into that category, but maybe less reliable. I don't know. I mean, is there an appetite for it? I would imagine so. I'm not sure what that looks like.
Or at least discussing it further, maybe. I mean, there's really good, there wasn't for a really long time good evidence of the impacts. I mean, there was an assumption that if you provide bike parking, people will use bike instead of cars. Or if you're by a metro station or a bus station, people will ride that instead. But for a long time, there was no actual data to support that. But SANDAG, which is the SCAG version for San Diego, the sort of government body that represents San Diego and the surrounding regions, several years ago, did provide really good data and outcomes of several different, well, not just bikes and metro or bus stations nearby, but several different other ways of mitigating or reducing vehicle trips or parking demand. And so if that's something that at least was worth exploring, we can bring some of that information forward. And maybe, you know, we already have a TDM section of our municipal code, but this might be a way of really effectuating it, enforcing it.
Well, Michael, you're exactly right. I mean, if you start looking at the entire city holistically, you know, adding complete streets, widening sidewalks, making places more comfortable for people to walk, or bike lanes, making it safer to not use a car, those can only help. So I don't know how those dovetail together. You know, I don't know that one can be reliant on the other, but they are certainly bedfellows, if you will.
When you say, are you thinking of incentivizing, I don't know if that's a word, incentivizing a developer, you know, you provide X amount of bike storage, lockup, then maybe you can get a reduction in parking code kind of thing. It's interesting to look at,
Yeah, and
definitely.
especially with smaller units, you know, if people, you know, they've
Yeah.
got a couple kids, they got bikes, now they've got no place to put their bikes, but if there were bike lockers in the development, you know, those things would be very helpful.
I think, did PCC talk about, and again, totally different scale, but like a shared car type scenario?
We had some discussions about that topic, but it did not end up in our development agreement or the regulations. Yeah.
Yeah, I just remember it sounded revolutionary at the time, and now I'm like, not even that much longer later. Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does, I mean, there are case examples. There's if you're familiar with Culver at all, there's a project by the name of Access Culver City. The co-op grocery store used to be there. It's right next to the metro station, just outside the metro station. They're probably working on that project when you were in Culver, maybe. It was one of the first mixed-use projects that the city built. But they required car share, and so they have 4 cars that are in the garage that the residents managed by the apartment management company. That the residents have an app and they can reserve the car in order to get a reduced parking rate, and it was 8 years ago now, or 7 years ago, when I had that conversation with them about how it was going, but it was pretty successful. So there are good examples of it. They are also right next to the metro station. It's a very different environment. I don't want to assimilate
For sure.
that environment to this at all, but there are good examples. you know.
One more thing just popped into my mind is, you mentioned sort of demographic shifts, census data shifts. I'm wondering if any of those, like the ITE data, how current it is, and if there is, just spitballing, if there's any data out there, or is anyone thinking about anything sort of additional changes in work and traffic use and parking needs, as in the post-COVID world, more people may or may not be working from home. And if you combine that with proximity to public transit and some of the other things, would that also maybe lead to a conclusion that you might need less parking as we look ahead? I don't know. It just, like, is there anybody looking at that shift? Because I know it's kind of recent.
Absolutely. I mean, that is, these guys know I'm a member of the Urban Land Institute, and that is a constant topic. The amount of parking lots that we have in America, and how little that we need them, because people are going to Ubers and Lyfts, people are having fewer kids, people are working from home. And so I do believe that is the trend. Less parking is necessary. I'm not a zealot like Donald Shoup, but I do believe that's the trend. So I feel comfortable reducing parking rates as we investigate the method to do so.
Yeah, and that's, again, trying to find the right balance there. It's like, making sure we don't require too much. If we're thinking about all these shifts put together, are we making it, one step less competitive than we would like? And how many different ways can we approach asking the question to decide if we like the mix that the PCC model seems to be directing us towards?
Let me ask this question. We're talking about R3 right now. The gorilla in the bathtub is commercial. As we look at the other side of PCH and new development with commercial, I mean, parking rates there are where to really be competitive. And so does that mean that we would have another opportunity to look at a sliding scale for commercial and other uses beyond residential?
That's something that we can look into in the future. I'm not sure if we will get into that in our land use element update process. That's perhaps a topic that we can kind of investigate when we initiate that.
I feel like
Yeah.
I might be derailing us a little bit too, but is there anything about tandem parking? Because it's currently, I forget.
We do
allowed
allow tandem parking currently, right?
in all R3.
We don't allow tandem for multifamily residential uses currently. We allow it for single family and two family residential.
Would it be allowed for a same unit in a multifamily? In other words, you're not blocking your neighbor in, but you're blocking, your husband in.
Right.
It is not allowed today, but that's something that we can look into, yeah.
Is there anything that links, I don't know, facilitating more housing by allowing tandem? Is that correlated?
Well, flexibility,
Yeah.
design flexibility perhaps.
You'll find a lot of, I don't know about in El Segundo, but just in my own search to buy a home or move and rent, and you'll find a lot of condo and townhomes built with tandem parking these days. I think it gives the flexibility that they need to utilize narrow lots that don't allow, the turning radius or whatever it might be to fit in a short and stumpy lot or something, that they get. Because now you buy a standard 50 by 100, there's only so many ways you can configure the parking by squeezing so many units in there.
Yeah.
So you'll see tandem parking a lot, and it probably has to do with just the additional flexibility that it gives them.
Yeah. I would be interested to see part of that incorporated into the study.
Yeah, I think that's smart. I mean, we're not increasing the parking count.
Right.
It's just giving a different configuration, again, to add flexibility.
One thing you mentioned about east of PCH, and all this could be for nothing because east of PCH, today, there's state legislation that prohibits us from requiring parking for new development within a certain proximity of what qualifies as high-quality transit corridor. The 3 stations for the Metro line, essentially, everything east of PCH falls within that half-mile radius. So for any new development, we actually can't require parking. And if we
Even
give the state,
commercial?
if we give the state long enough,
Wow.
they may extend that, and it may make this conversation about R3 sort of all for nothing, but I think it's worth having. But just, on the horizon, I would imagine the next, couple of years, the state would also be exploring forcing that issue everywhere.
Then
That's,
you won't even need us.
right.
That's right. I could be having dinner with my wife right now.
It will be
Yeah.
eliminated.
But I think if we can get ahead of that anyhow, it makes the conversation easier, and it's worth having it regardless. It's a
That's good. Thank you for
yeah.
clarifying that.
Anything else for staff? Do you have enough of what you need from us? This is just a receive and file, right? Or
Yeah, just a
in-
study session.
study session.
And then I mean, we did commit to a time frame with HCD, but there's nothing stopping us from coming back and having more discussion, or if we sort of map something out and we needed to explore more, there's, nothing really stopping us from that. I think as long as we continue to show HCD that we are making progress, we're having a discussion in a lot of different areas. There's much bigger fish to fry from cities that don't have housing elements that are compliant, or they're actively giving the state the middle finger, essentially. We're not doing that. We're actively trying to pursue the policies that they'd like us to pursue. So I think we can continue to come back until we feel comfortable with this.
Thank you.
What's next? Do you write this up and it goes right to city council, or it goes right to the housing?
We would come back to you.
Oh, you would? Okay.
Yeah, we would either come back to you with another presentation to get some more direction, or we would prepare an ordinance and then have a public hearing.
Great.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, what's the deadline?
We're supposed to complete these amendments, I believe, by the end of this year.
Okay. Report from Community Development Director.
Nothing specific other than welcome, Mark, to the first commission meeting. Handle it like a pro. But that's it from me.
Thank you. City Attorney's Office.
Welcome to Commissioner Christian and another strong roster of commissioners we have. Very.
Thank you, Joaquin. Planning Commissioner comments.
I just want to echo welcome to Mark. I've said before that I've seen you at more planning commission meetings than just about anybody in town. So welcome. I feel like you got such a great running start
Yeah.
for what it is that we do here. So
I have a lot to learn, and I'm happy to be learning from all of you, so contribute where I can.
thank you.
Welcome. We're happy to have you. And we wouldn't even have quorum tonight, so you're already.
That's what I realized today.
You're already earning your keep.
I just realized today. I was like, that's why I got appointed. Quorum, I'm walking distance.
It's good to have you.
Right.
Okay, with that, we will adjourn to the August 22nd meeting.